AI is transforming education, but in many schools, it's raising more questions than answers. In this episode of the podcast, we're joined by AI consultant Eric Hudson. He explores the real tension faced by schools of balancing progress with preservation. Eric brings a really unique perspective to this conversation, one that blends healthy skepticism with a bias for innovation. We'll talk about how integrating AI is more than just about selecting tools, but about changing a school culture to really focus on student-centered instruction. If you're a school leader navigating the complexities of AI, you're not going to want to miss out on this episode. So let's jump right in. Eric, thanks so much for being on the show. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I'd love for you to kind of set the stage for our audience. Who are you and what is the work that you do that you're most passionate about?
Sure. So I am an independent consultant. I work mostly with schools on a variety of topics. And right now, that's really about kind of the intersection of AI with teaching and learning and also with leadership. But I've been on my own for only a year. Before that, I spent 10 years at a nonprofit called Global Online Academy. They do passion-based online courses for high school students, as well as PD for teachers and school leaders. And I really spent 10 years kind of building a program at GOA. And most of that work involved coaching teachers, bricks and mortar teachers, and how to design and facilitate high quality online courses. So I really spent most of my time there at the intersection of teaching and technology.
Cool.
And before that, I was in the classroom. I taught for 12 years at a variety of schools in the US, mostly middle school and high school English. And teaching is really kind of where all my passion for sort of designing learning experiences and student-centered pedagogy, it all comes from my time in the classroom with kids.
Very cool. It just feels like you are perfectly poised for AI with your skill set to just take the world by storm.
Let's hope so.
So I think it's so funny because the tech is emerging and changing so fast. We're in July of 2024 while we're recording. So could you give us an update? Where does the tech stand? What can it do? What can't it do? What are you excited about in AI right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So something I've been talking a lot about with schools is we are kind of past the standalone chatbot phase of generative AI. So if you think to like almost 2 years ago when ChatGPT came out, there was this website you could go to and you could talk with a bot, right? And then more and more bots came out, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of months is we're kind of in this integration phase of generative AI. Google and Microsoft and Apple are talking about how bots and tools that we might be used to seeing on separate websites are going to start becoming fully integrated into like Google Workspace, Office 365, into our phones. And so it's something that schools really need to be aware of, that generative AI, the goal was never to have sort of a chat GPT you go to. The goal was always for these things to be deeply integrated into systems and workflows we use every day. And so sort of with that comes a lot of increasing sophistication in the tools. OpenAI just put out ChatGPT 4.0. Anthropic just put out Claude Sonnet 3.5. These are sophisticated, multimodal generative AI tools. They can work with images. They can work with large documents. They can create decks. They can create images. And so we've really kind of moved beyond the sort of text input, text output phase of AI. And we should really be focused on integrated multimodal models of the tool.
So what I'm hearing is that AI almost becomes your team, as opposed to like an isolated tool. It's more of an integrated system or like a team that you're working with.
Yeah, that's a very positive way to frame it. I think if you ask teachers, they have a slightly different take on how we should think about that. Sort of an enemy in the bushes is another way to think of generative AI in schools. But yeah, I think that's one way to think about it. I mean, the goal of these companies who own these models has always been to have AI become sort of like this seamlessly integrated assistant into everything we do. And so I think that's, this idea of assistance is something we really need to be talking about in education right now.
It makes me wonder, do you think that prompt engineering, rewind a bit. To me, prompt engineering was such an important skill when AI first came out, the ability to really well craft a prompt. Do you feel like that's becoming less important as these become a little bit more elegant and integrated?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the idea that we need to engineer really good prompts reveals kind of a flaw in the design of the tool, right? Like if we
Right.
have to come up with really good prompts, these tools aren't as good as, or they're not meeting the goals of these companies. And so they want to phase out prompt engineering as a skill. But as of
Mm,
right now, July 2024, it's still really important to know what kinds of prompts get the best output. It's still really important to know about sort of conversational prompting and that these tools really need to be coached through dialogue, and that's really important. So I think it still matters. And it's also a really important way to just build your literacy around AI, building prompts. But yeah, I think a year from now or so, we won't be talking about prompt engineering as a thing.
good to know. Do you have any top tips? So if I'm a teacher, I probably dabbled with AI, but if I'm trying to integrate it more into my workflow, what are some tips that you might have about either prompt engineering or just tools to be looking at?
It depends on kind of what's your baseline tech savvy, what's your existing relationship with technology. If you're a
Mm,
fairly tech savvy teacher, you know your way around a laptop, you've used some of those Web 2.0 tools that have been around for 10 years, then I would go into the general chatbots. Don't use some of those specialized like wrapper tools that are really popular, Magic School, Comigo. I don't think those are as sort of versatile as they could be. And so if you're a tech savvy teacher, go into a Claude, a ChatGPT, and then just start asking it about a teaching problem that you're trying to solve. I have found with teachers, it's less effective to be like, use this prompt, and more
mm,
effective to be like, what is a challenge you have in your practice right now? What's a question you're trying to answer that you've really struggled to answer? Bring that to AI, and ask it in the clearest and most specific way you possibly can, and see what it gives you and kind of reflect on what that process is like for you. I do think if you're a teacher who is not comfortable with technology, who doesn't have a lot of practice with it, going into some of those wrapper tools that are built to kind of eliminate the prompting friction,
mm.
might be a good start for you as well.
Very great advice. Yeah, I think always if we can start with our own problems, you have that buy-in and you have that motivation to give it a go. So very
Right.
solid advice, my friend. So asking around, I told you this before we press record, but yours is the number one voice I'm hearing about AI consultancy in US independent schools. So I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing for schools trying to integrate AI?
I mean, I think even just starting with your question, should we integrate AI, is the
Mm,
question that a lot of schools are asking. And if we do want to integrate it, how do we want to integrate it? I think something that I'm seeing a lot in schools that maybe I'm not seeing as much on like social media or whatever is, schools aren't super psyched about AI in a lot of ways, and I think it's really healthy. They're bringing a lot of really healthy skepticism because as much as AI can increase efficiency in certain regards, that also can be detrimental to the learning process. And a lot of schools I work with are really worried about the impact that generative AI will have on student learning. And they want to think through, what are ways we can integrate AI that preserve what we know to be true about how learning happens. And that's a harder conversation than like, what tool should we buy? Do you know what I
right.
mean? And so, I think that's the biggest challenge I found in working with schools on generative AI is you kind of have to have a harder conversation before you get into what tools should we buy, what skills should we learn, what programs should our kids be going through, because AI is a disruptive technology like smartphones and the internet before it, and that means that it's going to surface some stuff around core belief systems around schooling and education and learning that you kind of have to air out and talk about a little bit.
Well, it shines light on the tension that always exists in schools between progress and preservation. And I think if you're right that if you don't begin with those psychological fears, making people feel safe and heard and addressing that tension, and you just jump right into let's implement it, you're not really
Yeah.
going to get very far.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like the that sort of change management stuff around technology integration, where you've got to sort of get through the trough of skepticism and fear and whatever into that positive place. And you really have to demonstrate the value add. This is not something that you can really talk about in the abstract for very long. You really need to have come armed with some good examples, some really good questions, a chance to kind of figure out where the teacher's goals and needs really meet the tool, right? I think that's kind of where change happens.
Smart. If you're talking to a school leader who has a very skeptical team and they're really kind of stuck in the skepticism, what advice do you have for kind of getting through that trough?
It kind of depends on the group. I would say in the majority of cases, a lot of the skepticism is linked to a lack of hands-on experience with the tool. And so when I do workshops with schools, at least 2/3 of the time is with teachers on their devices in chatbots,
Awesome.
working through kind of a menu of guided activities that I've created for them so that they get a chance to really do some guided practice, some hands-on practice, and actually get a very concrete sense of what the tool can and can't do. And my goal there is not to get them to fall in love with AI. I'm not in love with AI. My goal there is for them to become more informed consumers and to build their AI literacy so they can make decisions about AI for themselves and their students that are grounded in what the tool can and can't do. I think the other way I approach it when I'm dealing with a skeptical group is just trying to get a handle on where the skepticism comes from. I think something that people can forget when we're talking about generative AI is the context. Very recently, education was fully disrupted by the coronavirus pandemic, right? And we really have not fully processed or recovered from that experience. And that experience was deeply tied to disruptions to the way teachers do things, to their sense of their own expertise, and to their relationship with technology. And I think it's important to remember that people are not coming into generative AI discussions just talking about generative AI. They're bringing in a lot of things that have come up for them around what education is for, what teachers are good at, what kids should and shouldn't be doing. And we should talk about those things too.
Heavy stuff, but it's so nice to get that perspective because I don't know that I've actually made that connection before. Like I obviously saw the impact that COVID had on tech and on tech literacy, but not that level of institutional trauma that really exists for everyone surrounding it.
Yeah, when I was at GOA, my last 3 years at GOA were the first 3 years of COVID. And even today, I still talk to teachers who would rather talk on the phone than be on Zoom because of their coronavirus pandemic experience, being on Zoom all day long. And, the other thing that I've been researching a lot besides AI in the last year is trust, and how trust happens, how it's broken, how it's built. And, I think there's just some work that schools need to be doing around trust. Coming out of the pandemic, trust between teachers and administration, trust between teachers and students, trust between schools and families. Like there's just a lot of, cultural stuff that I think when you talk about something like generative AI, it's all woven together in a really complex way.
So interesting. Well, and it is so cultural. There was an interesting study that came out from Stanford recently that students' self-reporting measures of cheating have been the same. So pre-AI, post-AI, we still see students cheating 60 to 70% of the time.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's from Denise Pope at Challenge Success, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that makes you wonder, what is the underlying culture here? That oftentimes when you talk to teachers, it's the first fear is, well, the kids are going to cheat. And if you come into it, well, they've been cheating already. So what is the culture that needs to shift what's broken that needs fixing.
Yeah. And, I think if you look at the work that Denise and Challenge Success have been doing over 20 years, one of the reasons why cheating didn't really go up that much when generative AI happened is because didn't really have that much farther up to go. A lot of kids were already cheating and were already doing a lot of cheating. And so, there's, like you said, there's root cause stuff to address. And, I think one thing I really try to get schools to think about is generative AI is surfacing conversations you've been having for years. It's not new in that sense. And, anything you talk about in terms of AI, you're going to have to talk about in terms of a lot of other things that have been happening at schools for a long time.
So beautiful. I'm curious, we've talked a little bit about the hardship that comes with integrating AI, but I wonder about the potential you see and what you're most excited about in terms of how AI can impact teaching and learning.
Yeah, I'm most excited by teachers who are showing a little bit of vulnerability and having an open dialogue with their students about AI in class. And so some of the things I'm seeing are English teachers who, when they introduce, say, a new essay to their students, a new essay project, on the first day, they throw, ChatGPT or whatever up on the screen in their classroom, and they feed ChatGPT the essay prompt.
Awesome.
And they let it write an essay right in front of the students. And they ask the students, how good is this? How do you know it's good or not? How could you do better? And I really appreciate teachers who are using generative AI as a way to make the assessment process more visible to students, to get them to think critically about what and why they're being assessed, and to kind of build the students' AI literacy through a critical conversation about the class, not about AI.
Right.
Because AI can infuse almost anything we do, you really need to be understanding the importance of writing an essay versus understanding what AI can and can't do. And that's what I'm really excited about, is teachers who are using AI as a tool to have those kinds of critical conversations with students.
I love that you mentioned that, because I feel like it's uncovering so many problems that we've had in assessment for so long that often, in lieu of knowing what we're assessing, if we don't really know what we're assessing, we default to an essay. And that just doesn't work with ChatGPT. It challenges us as teachers to be really crystal clear on what, why, and how we're assessing, and communicating that clearly with students. I don't know, I see a big shift happening in assessment that's been so needed for so long.
Yeah, I mean, if that's one of the side effects of all the generative AI talk, that we actually, really audit and interrogate our assessments, because not every assessment is vulnerable to AI.
Not at all.
But if you can figure out the criteria, like how do you determine what makes an assessment vulnerable to AI and what makes it resistant to AI? In my experience, that Venn diagram intersects pretty clearly with like student-centered pedagogy, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's, for me and the work I do around assessment, if that's an after effect of AI, that it shifts us a little more explicitly towards a more student-centered pedagogy, then I think that's a good thing, whether or not you're using AI to do it, right?
Right. Well, and I think especially if you're working with students 13 and older, there is a place for using AI in the classroom and asking, where might you and why might you use it for this task? What work is worth your cognitive load? And what have you already shown mastery of? And you can offload it to the AI. And what a beautiful thing to have that discussion in class versus just straight up banning it.
Right. Or sort of, yeah, because I think in what you're saying, the teacher has to have a certain level of AI literacy.
Yes.
And that piece of it is really important and also hard to get teachers to invest the time and energy required to kind of be literate enough in generative AI to have that conversation with students and to help students make that decision. That decision about, should I use AI for this or not, is really hard, especially when you're 15 years old and you don't have deep subject matter expertise in whatever it is you're doing. You really need your teacher to offer you some good advice in that scenario.
Scaffold the process. Yeah. I think that term AI norms and co-creating AI norms in the classroom, I'm hoping to see a big surge in that this year, because it feels like years 1 and 2 are really centered on policy and ethics. And it feels like in this next year, practical use cases and engaging students with AI ethically is going to be kind of the shift. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, just last week, I had this Substack called Learning on Purpose. And just last week, I wrote a post of kind of offering 4 priorities for the coming year in AI. And one of them was literacy over policy. And that we really need to, everybody wants an AI policy. But the problem with policy is that, first of all, you can't write a policy for a tool that's evolving this quickly. But second of all, policy doesn't do the thing that you want policy to do. Schools write policies because they want to change behavior, but policies don't change behavior, right? What changes behavior is giving people some information and some practice and then letting them make decisions. And that's literacy, right? Literacy is about really investing time and energy in teaching the people, employees and students, what these tools can and can't do, how to use them, and giving them some general boundaries around it. And I think schools' time is much better spent building literacy than drafting policy.
I love that. It's almost, there's language around that of creating an AI stance as opposed to an AI policy.
Yeah.
Go for it.
No, go ahead. Sorry, there's your question.
Yeah. Would that be your kind of advice to somebody if they were saying, no, I need to create a policy? Would your advice be more focus on your stance and focus on your literacy and your practice?
Yeah, yes. Although I would say even in articulating a stance, right? It's, I think my first step would be like, find out your people's stances, because there's no one stance on generative AI. And so I just think it's really important that leadership teams invest in learning from their teachers, their students, and their families. What are they actually doing and what do they actually think about generative AI before they come up with a stance? Because I think the challenge of sort of articulating a stance from on high at the administrative level at a school is you're not investing in buy-in at that point in time. And so I really do think this is a moment of like, well, why don't we approach this as a collective effort, a community effort to understand this thing and give ourselves the opportunity to actually like be inclusive around the different perspectives on whether or not this tool is right for us or not.
Beautiful. I wonder though, do you think there is a value in doing something like doing that through the lens of the school's values or through the lens of the school's mission? Because it's one thing only to get input from the community, but is there a value in grounding that in the work that's already been done to establish who we are as a school? This episode is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. Whether you're communicating with families, planning your lessons, or grading student work, you can do it all from one integrated and beautiful learning management system. Learn more at toddleapp.com.
Yes, of course. Of course, there's a value in doing that as a school. I think that, is your stance for AI open or closed is a really, that's something you can probably figure out right away just by looking at your mission or your values, right? Like if you, based on your mission and your values, are you going to take an assets-based approach to AI or are you going to take a deficit-based approach to AI? And then I think from there, it's going to find out sort of, well, what does that look like in practice is kind of the question to follow up from there.
Can you elaborate on that a bit further, an asset-based versus a deficit-based? What might be the viewpoints or the belief statements that accompany those?
Sure. So think about writing policy, right? If you're writing a policy about AI from a deficits-based approach, you're very focused on all the things AI can't do, what we should not do with things, what we do not do with AI. Whereas if you were taking an assets-based approach, you would be really thinking about what are ways in which, what can this thing do? What are ways we should use this tool? What are things we are going to advocate for when it comes to this tool? When you read school handbooks, especially around academic integrity, it's very, very focused on things you do not do or should not do, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I would argue with an assets-based approach, you're articulating your boundaries or norms around AI, around the opportunities it presents around differentiation, around increasing efficiency, around sort of empowering students to pursue inquiry projects more independently. Like those are the kinds of things that you would take a sort of the assets-based approach to. And of course, that approach comes with negatives, and you need to be addressing those and dealing with those. But I would even argue that an assets-based approach to AI would affect how you deal with the negative side of it, as opposed to kind of really just focusing on enforcing certain rules.
So moving from enforcer to collaborator would be the kind of stance between the two policies?
Yeah, moving from a compliance-oriented stance to a learning-oriented stance, I think.
We might be showing our bias slightly, but
no, I mean, like, yeah, of course we are. But this is the kind of thing that I'm trying to surface in conversations with schools: is what is your bias, right? Like,
yes.
Obviously, I've spent my entire career exploring technology's impact on teaching, right? So I have a certain bias, but like, trust me, I meet plenty of teachers that come with like a real analog bias towards these tools, and that's a very fair. They've been very effective for years, taking a more analog approach, and that's absolutely valid. So we've got to sort of surface those things and figure out where they overlap.
Very cool. We mentioned voices and collecting community voices, and I'm curious, in the work that you've done with families, what are the common questions, fears, excitements that have been emerging from those conversations?
Well, it's varied. This is my big takeaway from the last year is that every stakeholder group's perspectives on generative artificial intelligence is as varied as any other stakeholder group's perspectives on generative artificial intelligence. Teachers, students, leadership teams, boards, and parents. I think if there was one message I would bring to schools from the times I've spoken to parents, is that parents want clarity from their schools. They want to know, what are you doing about this? How can you help us talk to our kids about this? And what message from you should I be reinforcing to my kids around this, right? And I think that's something where, even I meet a lot of parents who are kind of in industries that are being disrupted by AI. I meet parents who are sort of in the AI field, who have a really deep expertise. And both parents in those groups say the same things that parents who have never touched ChatGPT say, which is, we want the school to tell us how they see AI's impact on my child's education, and we will help the school reinforce that message. I think that's the biggest thing. But within that, you're getting a lot of like the whole spectrum. Oh, this is a cheating dystopia that is going to ruin school, versus like, this is going to change the world, and you're a fool not to get serious about it right now.
I guess that feels challenging in lieu of what we said earlier about, like, there is a challenge in creating a policy to something that is changing so fast. So for parents and families who want clarity, and then we also want to have kind of an open-handed stance, how do you balance that as a school leader?
I don't think clarity is equated to policy.
Okay.
I think clarity could be, to use your word, stance. Like, what is the stance? And what's the plan? Like, you don't need to have a policy to have a plan, right? So let's say your plan is, look, we recognize that this tool has real implications for the work of our school. We're going to ground ourselves in our long-standing policies on academic integrity, acceptable use of technology, online behavior, anti-bullying. Like, most schools have those things already. We're going to use those things to inform our practice on AI. And over the course of the next year or whatever it is, we're going to prioritize literacy. We're going to teach our employees and our students about this tool. We're going to make time for it. And here's how we're making time for it, right?
Cool.
And then 6 months, a year from now, you will get an update from us about where we are in that process. And some schools are saying, look, it's too early for us to release some sort of detailed policy. But in lieu of this detailed policy, here's our plan.
Cool.
And I think that's the kind of clarity that parents are looking for.
Well, and what I heard there was, these are the questions we're asking. Here's a specific timeline of things you can expect moving forward. And yeah, clarity doesn't have to come with a black and white, here's our policy. It can come with, these are our wonderings as well, and here's our plan to find out about it. That so much more beautifully models our process as educators rather than just handing down something on high. Very cool.
Yeah, and we're going to engage you as families on this topic, I think is another. I think this idea of like co-constructing something with parents, parents are an untapped resource when it comes to disruptions in education because they work in fields that are being disrupted by AI. They might be in the AI field itself. They have real perspectives to offer in terms of what is AI's impact on the world beyond school, and how can schools use that information to make decisions about how AI works, in school.
Gorgeous. I'd love also to come back to, we talked a little bit about like practical uses of AI in school, but I'm curious to hear really the nitty gritty of the changes you're seeing of, how have you seen AI used by teachers in ways that just kind of made you go, wow, that's awesome?
I have seen teachers in advanced science classes teach the kids how to use AI to process large public data sets. So there's all these like kind of enormous data sets out there in a variety of fields. Like, there's one teacher who's teaching an astrophysics class, right? He's giving the kids huge data sets about exoplanets and having them create, and then ChatGPT can code apps that allow them to create visualizations that process some of those data based on the sort of X and Y axes that the kids define. You can do similar work in sort of statistics or other advanced science classes, right? I'm seeing language teachers. I just met a language teacher in Nashville a few weeks ago, and I really appreciate sort of the small but powerful move of, she was using this AI tool 11. It's a text to speech tool. So you put in text and then it generates like a human sounding podcast quality reading of that text almost instantly.
Cool.
She was a Spanish teacher, and, she was messing around with the idea that she wanted kids to hear Spanish in voices that were not her own. And so she was inputting Spanish text into 11, and she found that the tool allowed her to have this text read in all the different regional dialects and accents available in Spanish around the world. And so the kids could hear the same paragraph or same poem, in Castellano from Spain and, Argentinian Spanish, like whatever it is. And I think those are the use cases that get me the most excited, which is to go back to what we were talking about earlier, teachers who have a real clear sense of purpose around what they're trying to do in the classroom, and then can take that to AI and be creative and sort of exert their agency over AI, right? Manipulate AI so it does the thing they want it to do instead of the other way around.
It's so funny that I asked you the question, because I hate it when people ask me that question, because you don't want to give a listicle of, my top 10 AI tools. And I think that is such a lovely answer, is that it's so specific to what you need. And every classroom and every student is going to have different needs. And that's the beauty of AI, is that it's integrated into pretty much any function you can fathom. So if you can identify a problem that you're facing or a wondering that you're having, you can then go to the internet and find a tool and it's like a pretty fast adoption tool. It's not too hard to pick up most of these tools. So I might steal your answer moving forward.
It's yours. Feel free.
I love it. When we're talking about working with AI with students, we've touched on this quite a bit, but any kind of advice there on just the way to start those conversations, or language that's particularly helpful in those conversations?
Yeah, I think first of all, acknowledging the culture of AI that's in most of our schools right now. So the way ChatGPT rolled out a year and a half ago, all the discourse around it was, oh, kids are going to use this to cheat. This is for cheating. It can write
Mm,
essays. Like it's bad, right? And in my experience from talking to students, students have really internalized that in a lot of different ways. So for some students, that's been internalized as my use of AI is my secret behavior. I'm not going to talk to anybody about it. I'm
yes.
certainly not going to talk about it with my teacher. I'm not going to talk with my parents. Maybe I'll talk about it with my friends. For other students, that's been internalized as real fear of the tool. I'm not going to use this because I don't want to be punished for using it, or I don't
Mm,
want to be accused of cheating. And for other students, it's just been ignoring it, right? This is just, my school says this is bad, so I'm not going to touch it. And so, when a teacher walks into a classroom and is like, I want to talk about AI, the vast majority of what I hear from teachers is the reaction from the students is like, wait, what? They're kind of like scandalized by
it's like
even
a
the
dirty
prospect
word.
of talking about it. Right, exactly. And like, is this a trap? Like that's kind of the vibe that they get from students. So I think you have to acknowledge that, and start there, which is like, okay, we have not been talking about this for a year and a half. I want to
Mm,
change that. Here's why. And then I go back to this idea of co-construction.
yes.
How do you treat students? How do you kind of level out the traditional power dynamic of teacher student, try to eliminate that, right? And you are engaging in this exploration of this thing that's new to everybody.
Mm,
You're engaging in it together. And so again, I go back to that English teacher that would sort of put the essay prompt into ChatGPT, and sort of evaluate the output together. I advocate for that kind of approach. Like, let's open a chatbot, look at it together. Let's come up with different ways to explore what it can do. I've met elementary school teachers who, even though the kids are too young to use AI themselves, they're putting a chatbot up on the screen and they're saying to the kids, like, let's have it write a song. What do you want the song to be about? Or like, let's have it write a story. Or if they're using an image generator, like, what's your favorite animal? What's your favorite color? What's
mm.
your favorite thing to do? Okay, let's have a purple hippopotamus dancing. Like that's how you begin, for me, the literacy conversation with students is kind of embrace the unknown, look at something together, and then ask some open-ended questions about it. Like, do you think this is accurate? Where do you think AI got this information to make this thing? I mean, I think those are all really meaningful conversations to have with students. And I don't think for the most part they're happening in schools right now.
Well, because in a lot of schools, that isn't the relationship that's been established. There's still very much, from the top down, administration is over teachers and teachers are over students. And I think what we're seeing is this shift that we need to be more human and we need to be vulnerable in our classrooms and curious and model that. And in doing so, we build trust and we build a culture where it's okay to try things out. And maybe, oh, maybe I didn't cite this wrong, but I don't know. Can you help me with it? As opposed to, oh gosh, I'm going to get the red mark or I'm going to get expelled from school.
Right. Well, yeah. And I think a lot of that starts with just go into a class, even if it's the first day of school, just assume that your students are coming with a lot of prior knowledge and prior experience. And, that sounds so obvious, but I think that's really important,
Yeah.
that your students don't come to your class as blank slates or empty vessels or whatever sort of like patronizing metaphor we want to use. Like, I think if you simply ask them to share what they know and what they've experienced, you may learn a lot
Oh, yeah.
about what they can and can't do and what they think about AI. Like, as I mentioned before, a lot of students won't use AI for very valid ethical reasons. And that's worth learning about and understanding, why they come at it from that perspective.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's so cyclical from how, yeah, we as administrators talk to our teams about it. Hopefully, in doing that, we can see them mirror that with their students and we can encourage them to do that. So, as
Yeah.
leaders, if you're coming at it with this black and white policy deficit, should and shouldn't fear based thing, you're going to see that in your classrooms. And that, I think what we're both saying is the antithesis of what's going to benefit us in an AI future.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's
Mm.
right.
So, one thing that stood out to me in your work, Eric, is that you're so grounded in literacy and empowerment And I guess I'm curious more about what that means for you in the AI space.
Well, I think literacy leads to empowerment.
Mm,
And that's true with any kind of literacy. You teach someone to read and they are so empowered to do things they couldn't do before. And to be totally honest, I'm not sure what else we're supposed to do when it comes to AI. Like, what else are we supposed to do besides learn about it? It's only been widely available for a year and a half. The idea that anybody is an expert in it is kind of wild to me. And so we should learn about it together, and we should figure out a way to remind both our students and our colleagues that we have agency over it.
mm,
And so, what are the ways we can locate the ways in which we can use this tool for our own purposes? That's my definition of empowerment: is we become literate enough about the tool that we understand how it can be manipulated and used for us and for our students. And I think the reason why I advocate for that is because, not because it's easier, it is definitely the harder path, but because that's the durable, transferable skill that you're looking for in working with something like AI. What do you want your students and your colleagues to be able to do with AI 5 years from now? We have no idea what AI is going to be able to do 5 years from now. So the only thing you can really hope for or work towards when you're working with students and colleagues on AI right now is getting them to invest and feel empowered enough to continue to learn and explore the tool as it evolves.
mm.
And, I just don't believe that telling them what to do and what not to do with it right now is going to lead to that kind of empowerment. It's more about offering them frameworks for good decision making more than anything else.
Beautiful. I'm curious, have you found a curriculum that you like? Like, I should preface this by saying that I've looked at a lot of curriculum and I find that it's all really knowledge focused of like how AI works and how the information is generated. But have you found like a skills based curriculum that outlines this kind of stuff?
No,
Do you think
no.
anybody's working on it? Any glimmers of
Maybe.
hope?
I hope so. I hope somebody's working on it. I don't have time for that, but like this. But I hope somebody's working. I mean, there's a guy out of Australia named Leon Furze, Furze, and he's probably doing what I would consider to be the closest thing to what you're talking about. He's not writing curriculum, but he's very grounded in the experience of K-12 schools,
Mhm.
and he's very practical in thinking through what are the use cases for these things. And what I appreciate about his approach, because like the thing that, when you ask me about curriculum, the thing that really kind of like makes me spark or like rub against that idea is that the idea that we're looking for curriculum also means we're looking for a silo. We're looking for like, where can we put AI in our program, right? And I think what I like about Leon's work a lot is he nests learning about AI inside study of the discipline, right?
Mm,
So it's like, what is the role of AI in physics class, right? What is the role of AI in English class or whatever it is? And I think that is the kind of curriculum that needs to be built, as opposed to here's where we learn about AI over here, right?
mm.
I do think it needs to be embedded. And again, that's the harder path. But I think that's how you're going to get buy-in from students and teachers around the relevance of the tool. I agree with you. A lot of the curriculum I've seen is very much about AI as a topic
Which
and
makes
not
it siloed.
AI, right, exactly, and not AI as an application.
Right.
And that's the pivot that needs to be made. And I think there's a lot of talk around like AI literacy right now, and that's cool. But again, a lot of the exercises are like, go into a chatbot and ask it a question and like see what it gives you. And like that's again siloing it as a
Right.
separate exercise, as opposed to we study physics because XYZ. Here's how AI serves those
Mm.
goals.
Do you think there still stands like a discrete set of skills one needs to be proficient with AI? Things like um, being able to analyze an answer for validity and fact check and prompt engineering. Like, do you think that there is a role for that, or do you think it's more just kind of assumed and we'll figure it out? or like it naturally falls into the discipline?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I go back to sort of no, I think the sort of skill that I want people to know about AI is learning how to know when it's integrated into whatever you're doing. Like, how can you
Okay.
identify it? Because again, that integration stuff, most people, when I talk to teachers and I talk about like the autocomplete thing on when you text
Uh-huh.
on your phone, I'm like, that's AI. They're like, what? And I'm like, okay, this is the skill. Like the skill is knowing when AI is having an influence over what we're trying to compose, so that we can know and get better at recognizing when we're thinking for ourselves. That to me is a really important skill that's related to AI, right?
Mm.
But it's not necessarily limited to AI, but that to me is the really important skill, because it's going to get harder and harder to separate that out.
That's a very cool way of thinking of it. Woof. Any last
Yeah,
pieces?
it's
Yeah,
heavy,
it's like
it's
when
heavy
you think
stuff.
about that,
I
like
know.
everything's
It's
going to
like,
be so embedded in AI, and AI is going to be so embedded in everything that just knowing what is your own unique thought is going to be the skill. I hadn't thought of it that way, and that's pretty freaky, my friend.
no, yeah, that's like it's like it's a real thing. I mean, there's like I was at a conference in October, um, and the school had this panel of sort of thought leaders in the AI, and it was like quite the power panel. Like the founder of Instagram was on it, and like the woman who invented Google Analytics, and like Fei Li, who invented one of these data sets that AI is built off of. And they all were talking about, one guy was like, oh, there's this scene in Star Trek where Vulcan kids are going to their school, and every kid is sort of standing in a little pit, right? And the pit is lined with screens, and they're just learning by interacting only with AI. And this guy was like, that's the dream. And I'm like, is it?
Is it
is that
though?
is that the dream? And that's the thing that we just need to be super conscious of, is that, waiting for these companies or our
Mhm.
government to kind of do the right thing around education is like, that's not where they're going. And so we kind of have to starting right now, assert and insert our humanity into these things and like teach kids about that. Because if we don't, they're going to leave school and go into the world, and it's going to become a Vulcan Academy. And that's the kind of thing that I hope we avoid, is that we teach kids kind of what human-centered AI looks like, so that when they grow up and become empowered to make decisions about it that affect a lot of other people, they're making the right kinds of decisions.
Well, it circles back to that initial tension that we're facing with teachers now, that tension between progress and preservation. And I
Yeah.
think my natural inclination is always to say progress is always the best answer. But I don't know, that gives me a beautiful sense of pause when I imagine that Vulcan school. And I say, is progress for progress sake always the best answer? And potentially not. So,
And I mean, I think that's a really smart way to put it. And I would just stop referring to it as progress, because I think progress has a bias in it, right? I would
right,
think of it as like change.
change.
This is change, and how do we kind of figure out where this change is helpful and where this change is harmful, and what are the things we're willing to fight for in schools, and those are the things that we should be really preserving,
Mm.
right? And maybe resisting change in that regard, or advocating for a different kind of change, in that regard.
Well, this has opened a new pathway of thinking for me, which is always a gift and a
I'm
pleasure
so
and a delight.
sorry.
No, I feel so thankful, and just I think your insights are so human centric and so relationship building, and just that you have so much to offer our community, and I'm just so appreciative of the time that you've given us today.
Thanks for inviting me. This was a really fun conversation.
This is how you have fun.
Listen, this is what I do. This is what I do all day long.
Blow people's minds.
Not blow people's minds, but like let's try to have the hard conversation. That's what I so it's really fun that we got to have the harder conversation for sure.
So fun. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks, Cindy.